Okay, so everybody should see my slide now. And today we're talking about public library financial policies. So today I'm joined by Karen Reich, who is the library grants coordinator. Those of you who have taken advantage of the library grants and the IMLS grants and the LSTA grants are probably very familiar with Karen. Karen has a lot of knowledge in this area, so she is going to offer some kind of practical in the field kind of perspective. So it's not just the law perspective. And as y'all know, I'm Claire Mambiella. I'm the Library of Michigan Library Law Consultant. The previous slide had all our contact information on it, so don't hesitate to use that and contact us if there's anything that we can assist with. This is my standard disclaimer slide. Since we are going to be discussing legal concepts today, I'll have to let y'all know that I cannot be your lawyer. And if you have any questions or you suspect that you may have a real legal issue, you're going to want to consult your library attorney. If you don't have a library attorney, I strongly recommend that every library at least have a contact with a library attorney. So you at least have a library attorney's number that you can call when you do have an issue. You don't have to have a library attorney on a retainer, just someone that you have that you can reach out to if you have a problem. If you aren't sure, which library attorney you could use or who does that area of law in Michigan, I do keep a list. So if you reach out to me, I'd be happy to email that out to you. So today, what we're talking about, well, we are talking about financial policies, but more specifically, we're first going to go over some general practices with finances and libraries. We're going to talk about some necessary policies that are, a lot of them are legally required. Some of them are just, good practice. And then we're going to talk about drafting financial policies. So in the event that you don't have some of these policies, or you think about this and you look as we're going through this webinar, you consider, hey, I might need a policy that does something similar to that, or you branch off and you think of a totally new policy you should have. Hopefully this will give you kind of a head start on how to draft effective and legal financial policies. So why are we talking about this topic? Well, both Karen and I receive calls and questions about financial issues. And sometimes I stumble on them as part of research for other kinds of questions. A lot of times when I'm looking at establishment, if a library wants to know what their establishment is, or there's a question about establishment, or they want to change their establishment, as we dig into how they're set up, sometimes we find that the way that they're managing their money is not necessarily the way that their establishment would dictate. So, the important thing is that public libraries are government entities. Now, we all know that, at least I hope, we all know that, but it's also that, public entities have some very specific responsibilities and accountability with regards to public funds. And I think a lot of times because of libraries' unique space in government, the government sphere, because, we're government entities, but we don't always act like government entities, or we don't really seem like other government entities. It's very easy to forget that, public libraries are not typical nonprofits, and that, the money has to be handled in some very specific formal ways. Many times public libraries' financial relationships with their municipalities are either unclear, or they don't kind of operate the way that their establishment would suggest that they should or can operate. So sometimes there's a lot of murkiness and grayness with respect to how a library should operate with regards to their municipality, or how much access or authority a municipality has with regard to library money. And also, public library directors and a lot of times boards are not trained in public finance, right? So when you're in library school, and I know for sure when I was in library school, I actually had a whole class on how to operate a 16 mm projector. So we did not get financial policies. Karen, did you get financial policies in library school?
I did not. I had one management class that 20 years, 25 years later, I'm like, really? That's what they talked about?
Yeah. So, I think, we don't get a lot of that aspect, but it's very important. And for library directors, depending on the size of your library, it can take up a huge amount of time. So it's very important. Do you have anything else you'd like to add into why we're talking about this today, Karen?
Um, I would like to say that a lot of this sounds like, oh my gosh, I have too much to do. And it's a lot of time to take the work to do this. And sometimes it's extra money to contact an attorney. But this is essentially, like checking your tires before you go on a trip so your tire doesn't blow up on the side of the highway. It helps you deal with gadflies, people who are unhappy with government services. It helps you deal with issues with your staff. If you have a staff member who has done something wrong and it becomes a problem, having that policy in place lets you say this is what should have happened. The same with vendors. If you ever see how the state bids, frankly, a lot of that is to deal with vendors who complain about who got the bid afterwards. And then your issues with your municipalities. Sometimes you have great support and fantastic staff in your municipalities. Sometimes you have municipalities that don't understand why they should even transfer your millage money to you. So in any of those four situations, knowing you're on the right legal foot when something starts to go off track, or in the era of social media becomes really volatile and really public, being able to say, this was the policy, it was legal, we followed it, we're in the right, is really helpful. This is the ounce of prevention versus the pound of cure.
Mm-hmm. It also establishes some, good faith, so that if you do end up in court, the jury and the judge and the attorneys will look at that and say, well, they, in good faith, they had a policy and they, attempted to follow it and they did what they were supposed to do. So, that can reduce your liability for if there is something going on that shouldn't be going on. Okay, so the first thing we're going to talk about are just some general practices and general kind of theories and rules around this topic. So many libraries, especially small libraries, can operate in, it's very tempting and can operate in kind of this cookie jar mentality, which and I call it that because years ago I was Girl Scout leader for my daughter's Girl Scout troop, and myself and another mom got together, and it was right when I first moved here to Michigan, and we thought, oh, we're going to have a Girl Scout troop. And we thought, oh, great, we're just going to have like a little club. And, we really thought that we would just keep money in like a coffee can or a cookie jar. Like, it never occurred to us. So then this giant book arrived from Girl Scout Central with all of the administrative requirements. And oh my gosh, it was way beyond anything we had expected. I mean, there are rules and regulations and, oh my God, just the forms to fill out and the financial reporting. And so, you think that you're just going to sell cookies, but oh no, it turns into way more. And I totally understand it. But in the beginning, we were really like, oh, what did we get into? So I think public libraries often kind of think about that. Like, a lot of public libraries and public library directors and staffs are so invested in what they do. Because it's a calling. For many of us, it's a calling. It's not just a job. And therefore, the money and how the actual processes by which we have to report the money and spend the money and what we can spend the money on and not spend the money on and reimbursements, it's very easy to kind of put that on the back burner, because it's we're more worried about the service than we are about the details. And I think that in a lot of ways is what gets people into some trouble. It's not that anybody's trying to do anything bad. It's not that, people are trying to, mess with the books. It's honestly that people just have too much to do and their priority is to get the service out there rather than to make sure their books are exactly the way they should be. I want to make just a kind of a pitch here that we talk a lot about sample policies, and we have some really good ones in the public library financial manual. But you want to be really careful about, in any situation, not just financial policies, but you want to be really careful about just blindly copying another library's policies. Because the library that your friend works at or the library that you find online that has really good policies may not be the same jurisdiction as yours. It may not be the same state. It may not be the same, even if it's in Michigan, it may not be the same establishment type. So it may not have all of the same rules and regulations that you have to comply with. As we said before, in Michigan, even all of the libraries of the same establishment type do not all operate the same way and have their own unique kind of internal rules and histories and requirements and agreements with their municipalities. So you just have to be really careful. It doesn't mean don't look at sample policies to get an idea of how something could look or how all of these concepts we're going to talk about get spread out on a page, but always make sure that you look at it very carefully in terms of your situation and the requirements that your library has to adhere to, and that you make sure that your attorney takes a look at it. And like Karen says, it can cost money, but most attorneys, if you build a relationship with an attorney, and again, it doesn't have to be a retainer, an expensive kind of, formal contract agreement. But if you just establish a relationship with an attorney knows, okay, every time this library has trouble, they're going to call me, then a lot of times, once attorneys in this field do one policy, then they have that policy, and then they just need to tweak it for different situations. So it's a lot cheaper. Like, they're not reinventing the wheel with every policy they have. So, if you call Ann Suring, she can take her policy and tweak it for your library. She's not going to then have to do all the research and from scratch. So it's not going to be as expensive as you think. It shouldn't be as expensive as you think. And again, it's definitely worth the money, right? It's like Karen said, an ounce of prevention. And it's also, if your board gives you a hard time about this, remind them of their fiduciary duty, right? A board has a fiduciary duty that they take an oath for, that requires them to always act in the best interests of the library, particularly with regard to financial matters. That's why it's called a fiduciary duty. A lot of it has to do with money. So, they are, they're not really thinking of the best interest of the library if they're telling you, well, we're not going to spend money on a lawyer to, review our financial policies when we think we might have a problem. You want to say anything about that, Karen?
No, that all sounds good to me.
Okay. All right. So let's give you a couple of facts on public libraries and public funds, because in our time frame, unfortunately, we don't have enough time to give you a whole class on public finance, although I know Karen's going to talk about an option where you could take a class. So we're just going to kind of give you some background facts. So all money that goes into your account in your public library are considered public funds. And that doesn't matter whether they're donated by the grandmother, whether they're given to you by the friends, or whether they're from your millage. So the big difference in, if you get a donation, so we talk a lot about, things like the public purpose doctrine, you can't use money, say, in other words, to buy food for your staff, right? Or staff appreciation or flowers for someone who's sick. But if you have someone make a donation that's specifically designated for that purpose. So if your friends group gives you money and says, this money can only be spent on staff appreciation, then that's a legal way that you can spend that money on that purpose. But that doesn't make that money not public money. So anything in your account is public money, right? So the minute it gets in your bank account, it's transformed into public money because you're a public entity. So that's very important to understand. The other thing is, in Michigan, we have approximately 10 different establishment laws, or 10 different establishment types that are created by 6 different establishment laws. Now, depending on your establishment is going to decide how much authority your governance, your library governance, has over your money, over the library's money, how much control your municipality has. So that, that can differ widely. Not, as I said, not only because of the law, but also because of some very specific relationships that a municipality may have with their library. A big example is if you're a PA 164 city library and you have a 5-member board, appointed board, then you're a PA 164 Section 1 library. And if you read Section 1 of PA 164, that your city can actually retain some control over your operations. It's usually not a substantial amount of control, but there are some things that they can put into that ordinance that they used to create you, or the charter, or the resolution, that can affect. Also, their ability to levy an unvoted millage provides, creates some kind of differences between like what you would have with a voted millage. So there are some differences, and that's important to understand. So this also goes to, please understand what your establishment is. It is key. I can't tell you how many times I talk to libraries who have no clue. And this is important. You're not just a city library under PA 164. What type of city library are you? Are you a 10A with a 6-member elected board? Or are you a Section 1 with a 5-member, a 5, 7, or 9-member appointed board? Are you a joint board? All of those things can matter. So it's important that you understand that and that you read the law that applies to you. A lot of the financial requirements and limitations in Michigan are driven by constitutional language. And then there are statutes that were put on the books to implement these constitutional tenets. That means that they're not movable. That's it. That's the way it is. Those are the requirements, and that's the law. Whether a municipality says they're not, or whether a board member says that doesn't matter, it doesn't apply to us, doesn't change the fact that yes, it does. And it is a law. The fact that your municipality may be doing something that isn't quite kosher does not give the library free rein to also do it. So if you have somebody call you on the carpet for something that you're doing with financially that's not appropriate, saying that, well, my township does it that way, is not going to get you off the hook, right? So it's very important that if you have a concern and you bring it to your board or you bring it to your municipality and they say, oh, they poo-poo it and say, oh no, this isn't, this is what our township does, then again, this is another reason why it's good to have an attorney. If you're non-compliant with some of these financial things, an auditor is not always going to tell you. I've also had libraries tell me, well, we never see anything on our audit. Well, the audits are designed to catch certain specific things. An auditor is not going to look at every single purchase you make and every way you spend your money. So there are times when the auditor is not going to catch things that that may be going on. And this can be specifically true if your audit is done as part of your municipality's audit. And lastly, like Karen said earlier, a lot of this is risk. So, there's no, quote unquote, financial police that are going to go knock on your door and ask, what are you doing and how are you doing purchasing? What's going to happen is either you're going to have some other, thing happen that's contentious, or you're going to have a member of your, community who is unhappy with something or has a burr under their saddle about something, and they're going to go looking for things. And they're going to look for things that are non-compliant. Or you're going to have a municipal officer who for some reason doesn't like the library, or is looking for an excuse for the municipality to take over their funds, or for the municipality to pay less, or, something, and they're going to look for it. So, you may have a staff member who is not happy. So, there could be many reasons why this comes up. And you could have gone 20 years without anybody noticing and you doing this same thing. Well, that doesn't mean that what you did was okay, right? It only takes one complaint, if it's, reliable enough to kind of, get you into trouble. So, this is one of those things where it's only a problem when it's a problem. Karen, do you want to weigh in on that?
Yeah, I'll jump in a little bit with Claire. Claire and I both hear this, me from the grant side and Claire from the legal side. Municipalities are stressed for money right now. Not that they aren't in previous years, but we're hearing a lot of municipalities that won't turn over funds to libraries or want to charge libraries for services. And the municipality may be unfamiliar with how the finances should work with your legal status and are trying to treat you like another department. And you really need to know, absolutely know, and can quote chapter and verse what the situation is when you're trying to tell your city manager that, yeah, you actually should be getting your millage. It happens. And it's good to be accurate and understand what they can't do. Not that they want to hear that, but it's a lot easier to have the conversation when you're sure what your status is.
Right, absolutely. And a lot of times your municipal attorney. So if you are a city library and you're relying on your city attorney, or you're a township library relying on your township attorney, know that there's a very good chance that your attorney is not versed in library law. Now, there are some municipalities that contract out for their attorneys, and they contract out with like Foster Swift or Miller Canfield, and big firms that have library law people, and that's a little different. But a lot of them don't. And so if you have a municipal attorney who is strictly municipal law, they may not really understand the differences either in library law. So that's also important to note. Okay, so here are some additional kind of facts. A library with a governing board. So if you have a governing board, so those words are really important, and they're usually in your statute, your establishment law. If you have a governing board, your governing board has financial control over budgets and expenditures, right? So if by definition you have a governing board, your municipality should not be making decisions for purchases and things of that nature. There may be some, again, if you're a city library under Section 1, there may be some collaboration with some financial actions, but things like creating the budget, things like deciding whether or not to go for a millage, things like creating policies are the purview of the board by law, by the statute that you're created under. So if you have a board that is not handling the money or seems disinterested in tracking the money, then that they are not complying with what their statutory duties are. That's one of the major statutory duties of a governing board, is to keep their eye on the money. PA 164 libraries, so township and city libraries, have control over budgets and expenditures. So, right, they have exclusive control over expenditures is what the statute says. So that includes the budget, again, millages, whether or not to go for a millage, whether or not to renew a millage, how much to levy in the millage, and financial policies. But the cash of the library sits in the municipal treasury. That is also in the statute. So that means that your municipality is kind of like your bank. You should have separate accounts. The statute says you have to have a separate library fund. And the municipality has to provide reporting. It's not the municipality's accounts, it's the library's account. But the municipality does a lot of your bookkeeping. They write the checks, they disperse the funds, but they can only disperse those funds on approval of the library board. And that's in the statute too. So it's designed to be kind of a checks and balance, right? So the library board spends the money and decides how that money gets used, but the municipality cuts the checks so that either side has a chance to see if anything is happening incorrectly on the other side. So that was kind of the idea behind that. I know that many municipal libraries under PA 164 have their accounts handed to them by their municipality and say, you're going to take care of your own books. Technically speaking, that is not in compliance with this statute. A library should not be having their own bank accounts, but there's not a lot you can do if your municipality says, here, we're not going to do it. So that in that manner, you pretty much have to talk to your attorney and you manage the best way you can. It doesn't get you out of complying with the financial, policies and stuff we're going to talk about. But that's definitely a situation where you kind of want to get, have a discussion with your attorney on the best way to handle that. All library establishment types, I said must have separate library funds. We've been running into lately a problem where municipalities, and a lot of times this is, the smaller city and township libraries, some small districts, where the municipality is commingling funds, which means they're dumping the library monies into the same bank account where their general municipal fund is. And that is specifically prohibited by the statute. They cannot commingle the funds. So if your library is doing that right now, you should have a conversation with your municipality, and whatever entity in your municipality is the person who has the power to fix that. And also make sure, if you're a library director, that you have a conversation with your board about this as well. Anything to do with money in a public library in Michigan is the purview of the board. So like it or not, that means that the library director has to bring the board in when it's about money. Because if the what hits the fan, it is the board that is going to get the censure. It's the board that is going to be sued. So the board has a right and an obligation and a duty to know what's happening. So, all you board members, if there's any board members out there, if you're not asking about financial reporting and you have no idea about the finances in your library and how they run, then that's a big problem. Library boards and municipal officers, if you are a library where your municipality is your library board, so if you're a city library run by charter, or you're a charter township library so that you essentially are a department of your municipality, then your municipal governing board is your board. If you have a governing board, so PA 164 library, district libraries, city library, county libraries, all of those governors of those particular entities have a fiduciary duty towards the library. And that means that fiduciary duty means they have to act in the best interest of the library. So not in the best interest of their personal belief about finances, not in the best interest of their municipality, not in the best interest of, how they think that, tax money should be spent, in the best interest of the library. So what is best for the library and the services and the mission that we provide. And all library governing boards should really understand, as I said, completely how their library's finances work, inside out. They should really understand the process, and they should get frequent reports about what is happening with the money and how the money is spent. Karen, do you have anything you'd like to add?
I'm going to pop back up to the governing board. Like I say, from the grants perspective, I tell people when they're submitting terms and conditions to me, that it depends on their local establishment. And, in general, I'm going to accept what they submit. On the other hand, with us and with a lot of other grant funding agencies, the terms and conditions you submit with an application are essentially your signatures. Well, not essentially, they are your signatures on the grant contract if it's awarded. And I see things that I know aren't right. every now and then I have to kick back. The children's librarian cannot sign as the director. But I'm going to say especially after 450 grants last year, there's a lot of libraries that don't know who can sign their contracts. And that can be an issue if there's any, if you're signing other contracts. I'm going to work with you. Our interest here at the Library of Michigan is to serve you as best as we're able. If you're signing contracts incorrectly with a faulty understanding of how the governing board works, with other vendors, other institutions, they may not work with you. I'm going to say, be really careful about that.
And that's excellent, Karen. I'm glad you brought that up, because we run into that too. And we actually kick back. So if you have a service contract with a municipality and you send it to us so that we can put the population in for state aid and penal fines, we will kick it back to you if the library director has signed it. Because unless your board has given you, official has officially delegated to you the authority to bind the institution into a contract, library directors do not have that authority. The board, as the legal representative of the library, has the authority, is the only entity in the library that has the authority to bind the library to a legal contract, unless they delegate that authority to their director, which they can. But you're going to want to make sure they do, and either a resolution or a vote or some kind of, proof that you can show if the question ever comes up. And just having a vendor tell you, oh no, it's okay if you sign, doesn't necessarily mean the contract would be held valid if push came to shove.
Yeah, and if you get into a squawk with a vendor and they figure that out, and the vendor says, well, I don't have to deal with your complaints about my service because the contract wasn't valid. Something to think about.
Or we don't have to keep the price that we quoted you. Okay, so we're going to now talk about some specific policies. Kind of just again, as kind of an overview benchmark, good policies. When you talk about policies, what makes a good policy? So good policies are clear and easily understood. And we've talked about this a lot when we talk about patron policies and things like that. Good policies are developed with input by those who must implement them, right? Because the library director cannot be everywhere at once, even though it seems like a lot of you are, superheroes, and you can. But, there's going to be times when you're not going to be at the library, and you may have a staff member, or maybe you have a staff member who is the financial person, the person whose job it is to handle a lot of the paperwork. They have to understand policies, right? So you want to get input from the people who have to actually implement and enforce the policies to make sure that it's going to work, that the policy is going to actually do what you intended to do. You want to make sure it corresponds to applicable law, which means you need to know what the applicable law is. And we have a lot of resources at the end of this presentation that will help you identify what those laws are. Like any good policies, you want to make sure they are regularly reviewed and updated, because once you do them, if you leave them for 10 years, laws change, right? Financial practices change, best practices change. The governing administrative rules like GASB and FASB change. Good policies are approved by the library's governing body. Again, you want to get back to, I understand, believe me, I understand that there can be issues in dealing with boards. But the fact remains is that when you look at the hierarchy of the library, and the library as an organization, so for lack of a better word, as a business, right, as a legal entity, the board holds all the authority. So if a policy were to go bad and someone were to sue you on that policy, they are suing the board. So they're not suing the library director, absent some kind of, even if it were a library staff member did something egregious, right? They're still going to sue the library board. They may also sue the staff member, but the library board is still going to get sued for hiring the person, for keeping the person, for not watching the person. So if you're a library board member, at the very least, you have a right, to know what you're getting yourself into. So, if you look at it just on the most basic level, it's not fair for a library board member to be on the legal hook for policies that they had no hand in, or policies that they're unaware that exist. And so that's why when policies are being created, they need to be run by the board and they need to be approved by the board. Doesn't mean the board has to write them. In fact, it's better for the library director to write them in accordance with the attorney and all those other best practices. But it's important for the board to approve them. So the board runs through them, the board can have questions answered. The board can, maybe have input, but it is, to just set them up and run with it and not give the board any opportunity can be a problem, particularly with financial policies. Smaller day-to-day policies can be a different story. Again, the board can delegate duties and authority to the library director. But when you're dealing with financial policies, that is something you absolutely want to make sure that your board has seen and approved. Always make sure they're reviewed by the library attorney, even if you do it in batches. If you don't want to incur costs all the time, set up an appointment to talk to your attorney once a quarter or even once a year to go over policies. It doesn't have to be done all at once, but it's really important that you get some eyes on those policies that has a real understanding of the law and of language, of how different policies, the ramifications of different policies, and that your policy accomplishes their objective, right? That your policy actually is going to do what you hope it does. And all policies are public record. That means that, part of a legal policy is notice, right? So that the people who have to abide by it know what it is and know that there is a policy. All of your policies should be readily available for members of the public. I would strongly encourage you to post them online. The Constitution actually says that all financial documents and all financial information with government entities is public record. So that's very key. You don't want to try to hide your policies. If you put them out on the web, that just shows we're transparent. We have nothing to hide. If it takes a FOIA request for someone to get a policy out of you, that's almost like saying, we dare you to find something. That's a problem. What do you think, Karen?
I'm going to take it in a little bit different direction on this. Once you have the policies in place, not to knock the state of Michigan, but then what do you do? The state of Michigan is fairly famous for, there's policies on obscure corners of websites, and staff that work with that never know they exist. So not to say, like Claire said, you guys are fantastic and your workloads are awful, but once you have a policy in place, then you need a procedure, and you train your staff, and you train your staff, and you train your staff on that procedure. Things, a lot of things, when they start to blow up, they're going to blow up with your frontline staff. If they don't even know the policy exists and they've done the incorrect thing, that's really problematic. The well-oiled machine is one where your staff knows there's a policy and they know what their duties are procedurally to implement it if there's an issue or if it's part of their workflow.
Absolutely. Thank you for bringing that up.
And yeah, I'll ding the state of Michigan for that. We're awful. We're telling you, do as we say, not as we do.
Absolutely. Okay, so the laws we're talking about here, we're not talking about every single law, because frankly, there are just way too many of them. And this would be a very long and very, very boring podcast, very, very boring webinar. So primarily the ones that we're going to be looking at are things like the public purpose doctrine, which is, strictly speaking, kind of more something that is enveloped in different laws. It's not necessarily law in itself, but it is a doctrine that's been adopted by Michigan in case law and in various laws. This is the doctrine that says that any purchase that you make, any expenditure of public funds must be done for a public purpose. That means anything that you buy has to be for the benefit of the public at large. So, if we take the example of food, if you buy lunch for your employees, that is not public purpose. If you buy coffee and have it on your budget line and you put it in the library for all members of the public to have, that is a public purpose. And so, you could have a candy jar on your reference desk or your circ desk for the entire public to partake of, including your staff, but you cannot have a candy jar in the staff room that is paid for by public funds. So it has to be something that is for, the entire benefit of the public. Now, things like training are found to be public benefit. And, because having good, well-trained public employees benefits the public in many ways, including, careful oversight of finances and things like that. But saying that giving my, bringing in a massage therapist and paying them for your staff helps your staff not be stressed out and do better work is not going to be looked at as a public purpose. So, it's really important that you are careful with those fine lines. And it's hard, believe me. I don't like being the bad guy that tells library directors that she can't buy her staff, Big B or cocoa or, a pizza. I hate that because I'm the kind of person that buys people pizza and cocoa. But the law simply says that if you do it, you can't be reimbursed for it. That's unfortunately just the way it is. I don't write the laws. I just talk about them. Governments and government entities can only spend public money if they are authorized by statute to do that. So your library establishment law provides that your board is authorized to spend money, to handle expenditures. They are also authorized to delegate some activity to you and your staff. So that's where the authority comes from. So it's important to note a library director does not have any authority under the statute. All the authority comes from the board, and it is the board that has the authority to purchase. And nothing can be purchased unless there is a statutory authority to purchase. I'm going to make a mention about campaign finance laws. There's a lot of libraries that are heading into millages. These are, again, some of the lines get very gray because, as we all know, there's like 5 people in any town that volunteer and do everything. So it's not uncommon to have members of your board also be on your friends group, also want to be on your campaign yes committee. And you have to be very careful about those lines. A board member is permitted to have, political preferences in their personal life. So as a personal citizen, they can be on a yes committee. They can campaign for funds, but they cannot do that with the hat of their board member on. Mm-hmm. So, I had a library the other day that told me that one of their board members had fundraised for their yes committee. And it's like, no, that shouldn't have happened unless they were doing it totally on their own time. But the fact that it was being reported in a board meeting makes me think that maybe it wasn't. So those are lines you have to keep very separate. And the same with friends groups. And we're going to talk about friends groups a little later, but you have to be, really careful of some of these laws, especially the campaign finance laws, because those are strictly monitored. The campaign finance laws are looked at. Some of the more esoteric municipal spending laws may not, but campaign finance, oh yeah, you will have somebody that pings you on a campaign finance misappropriation. Conflict of interest. So if, again, this happens a lot with smaller entities, you have a member of the public, or excuse me, you have a board member who has a husband who is has a business. Maybe they're a contractor and the library needs some work done. So the instinct is, oh, you know what, I'm going to have Bob do it. And then, he'll give you a really good deal and we'll just pay it. No. Because you are the board members directly benefiting from that money, even though it's done with a good intent. We're going to save library money. We know it's going to get done well. It's a good deal. it can't happen with any kind of involvement of the board member who is related to the person. And that's why you have to have really good purchasing policies. So, and because it also protects the board member so that there's no hint that there's any kind of, behind the scenes, oh, all of the library's, maintenance work is going to be done by my son, by my son's company, so that, he's going to earn some money. Even with the best intentions, you want to stay very far away from that. Again, all of the different establishment laws and constitutional provisions on lending of state or municipal credit. This is kind of a esoteric thing, but it's very important. The preventing or the prohibition on lending of state credit, and cases have found it to also apply to municipalities, simply means that you can't use state money as a way to secure credit or secure other sources of money. And it kind of speaks to the reputation of the state. This is used for a whole lot of underlying of financial requirements. And in fact, a good example of it is the next thing we're going to talk about, which is a credit card law. And this is admittedly not a very practical law, and it's one that I would change in a second. And I think we are having some discussions of maybe possibly seeing how this could be changed. Right now, there is a law on the books that it's called the Credit Card Act that permits municipalities to use credit cards, to obtain and use credit cards. When you read that law, and as I've said before, one of the most important sections of a law is the definitions section. The definition of local government unit, or the definition of municipality, includes everything but entities like public libraries. So it includes, your city, state, cities, village, counties, townships, school districts, and then it says entities that are under the Municipal Finance Act. So if you look at the District Library Establishment Act, it makes a point of putting district libraries under the Municipal Finance Act, which is an act that dictates financing for government entities. So things like bonds, right? Township and municipal libraries are not under the Municipal Finance Act. And the thinking, I believe, is that's because they're tied to their municipality. So even though the laws that establish them give their boards a lot of autonomy, there are some things that they still are tied to their municipality for. And this is one of them. So because a public library, except for a district, is not included as a separate, distinct entity under this law, you have to go through your municipality to get a credit card. And part of the reason why it's regulated is this idea of lending of state credit, right? Using the reputation and the treasury of the municipality for the benefit of your entity is something that can only be done under certain circumstances. And it's the same idea why when you have an investment policy, one of the prohibitions is you can't invest in typical stocks, right? You can't invest in the stock market, and it's the same reason why. So, and though that credit card law is very inconvenient, because of course it was done in 1976, and nowadays we're all very tied to credit cards because of online purchasing or debit cards. The law doesn't address debit cards at all. So what I have been telling libraries is that if you manage your own money, right? So if you are one of those libraries where you hold the keys to your own bank account, then a debit card is pretty much like a check. And as long as you don't, you're not using it as a credit card, if you're using it as a debit card, you're probably okay. But you, again, depending on your establishment, might want to double check with your attorney. If you accept credit cards, right, that's a whole other law. Accepting credit cards, that was also passed, or I'm sorry, they were passed in 95, not 1976, 95. They were both passed at the same time. And 95 still, too, 90, the internet just kind of came about right around that time, just started. So again, the whole idea of using credit cards was not as ingrained in the culture as it is now. The receipt of credit cards, they call it financial transaction devices. One of the things that is defined as a financial transaction device is a debit card. So it almost seems like, okay, at one point they amended the law for one, but not the other. But in this case, it's kind of good because, again, if they had put debit card in the credit card law, you definitely wouldn't have been able to use them either, because the financial transaction law has the same problem. Definition does not include or cuts out everything but district libraries. So, again, you got to read your definitions when you're making projects and you're planning things. You want to take fines with a credit card. You got to be careful and make sure that you're doing it the right way and that you're complying with all of the necessary steps. And that may include going to your municipality and saying, look, we need this to operate, and the only way we can get it is through you. Let's work out a way that, we pay you back, or however this works. And this is another reason why municipal relationships can be very important. Try to make friends with someone in your municipality, the treasurer, someone on the city council, someone who can help go to bat for you when you have some of these sticky things. It takes work. And you may be gritting your teeth the whole time you're doing it, but even just a lunch, having lunch once a quarter or once, every couple of months, can be extremely helpful with regards to building those relationships. Sending information to this person on things that she's interested in or he's interested in. They're a golfer, they're a knitter, send them articles or something as hey, we just got this great knitting book. I know you're into knitting. We have a Cricut that we lend. Would you like me to put you on the list to borrow it? Just treat them maybe like a VIP patron. And get in their good graces, and then they can be very helpful and ease the way for you when these kinds of things come up. Karen?
Nothing to add, except when you first said cricket, I thought you actually meant a bug.
Oh.
Oops.
Those two, hey, I'm sure lots of libraries have crickets too. The library I worked at in Miami, we had a giant palmetto bug that would come out every night and greet people.
Oh dear.
Yeah. Palmetto bug is a giant roach with wings. For those of you that don't know, they're aggressive. Yeah, they're not fun. But yeah, we called him Hector. He would come out every night because all of us were too afraid to kill him because he was so big. So we had kind of detente with Hector. Okay, purchasing policies. And you can see I have a lot of stuff on this slide because this is a really important one. So when we talk about purchasing policies, this can come under a really big umbrella. So purchasing can include everything from your book acquisition policy, your petty cash policy, when do you hand out petty cash? How is it recorded when you hand it out? A reimbursement policy. Who in your staff has the authority to, you see something in, Staples or Target and you say, oh my gosh, this would be so good for summer reading. They're really cheap. I'm going to buy them and get reimbursed. Who has the power to make that on the spot decision in your organization? And how much money can they spend before, someone says, wait a minute, who told you could spend $300 on, paddle balls for summer reading or whatever? Then your general purchasing policy, right? Which would cover things like, who decides, how do you decide who's going to shovel your walk? Who decides, if who's going to refinish your library tables or reupholster chairs if they need it? Who decides that we're going to purchase toys for the children's area? Who decides that we're going to get soap for the bathroom? All of those kind of general purchases that are not library materials like books, which would come under your acquisition policy. Who decides about those, and how much money are they able to spend? Does the director have an amount of money that they can spend on things without getting approval by the board, which is pretty common. You can spend up to 1,000, 5,000, whatever your board says. How is that accounted for, right? How does the director record those purchases to make sure that it shows that, okay, this is what I spent the money on, this is how much this thing cost. I wasn't out buying Big B for myself or pizza. Your credit card policy. If you have a credit card, you need to have a really good policy on who can use that credit card, under what circumstances, what can the credit card be used for, and how is the use recorded and reported? How is the credit card paid? Whose responsibility is it to make sure that it gets paid? Where do the statements go? Reconciling the statement with individual receipts. And that's the same like with your acquisition. I used to, years ago, I was the manager of a law firm library, and, part of my job was to, we would receive new books, and law libraries get, have a lot of extra things because they get updated a lot. And you'd have to mark each one and get the packing slip and reconcile it with the invoice. So if that's the way that you handle purchasing your acquisitions, then who does that? And then who makes sure that these are then all of these receipts and all of these invoices or statements are retained, right? Where are they filed? Are they scanned? If they're scanned, how is that handled? Then also in policies, as we talked about, you got to consider who can purchase. As I said, limits of expenditures before approvals. What can be purchased. And this also brings in the public purpose doctrine, campaign finance laws, grant requirements. What can you use this money for, and what can you not use this money for? Right? Can you use this money to purchase? Can you buy used items? Can you do an auction? Can you purchase money at an auction? There are sometimes unique things that come up that you'd want to make sure that you have this set. If the director is going on a trip to they're presenting at a conference, can the library reimburse them for food? Can the library reimburse them for incidentals? And incidentally, the answer to that is probably yes. If you're having a training in your library, can you feed your staff then? The answer is probably yes. If that training is being conducted during normally eat, and therefore, it's a mandatory training, and so they don't really have a good way to, bring their own food, or then yes, the library could pay. That's most likely justifiable as a public purpose because it's part of the training. How is it purchased? Do you purchase it and then get reimbursed? I know that because of this credit card issue, there's a lot of board members who tell me they're putting things on their credit card and getting reimbursed so that the director doesn't have to. That gets sticky because libraries are also tax exempt, which means, you can purchase things and not pay taxes. So you'd have to make sure, again, that that's a factor of the purchasing process. What if that board member leaves? What if that board member, what if you have a problem with that board member? So again, not necessarily the best option. But if you do implement that, you want to make sure that there are very clear policies and procedures for how that is going to work. Do you do bids? Do you have a bid policy for larger purchases, or when does the bid process kick in? How high is that limit? And then what is that bid process? And part of this is there used to be laws that required municipal purchases to be bid. That is no longer the case. The state has a law that requires the state purchases to be bid, but municipalities no longer have to engage in bidding. However, many municipalities still have ordinances on the books or policies that require bidding. So if you're a township library and your township requires a bid, you have to follow that, right? You have to follow your township ordinances. If you are a district library, you probably should have a bidding policy. The fact is that the General Accounting Standards Board, so GASB, which is, or the Governmental Accounting Standards Board, I think is what it is, right, Karen? I think it's governmental.
I had to play that back in my head.
Right. So the overall professional administrative agency that kind of looks at government finance and decides what is a best practice and what is not, which is something a lot of states legislators look at when they're coming up with laws, will say that bidding is a best practice. So it is highly recommended that if you're going to be engaging in high purchases, so tens of thousands of dollars, or a high expensive purchase, that you bid it out. I'm going to let Karen kind of expound on that. Do you want to expound on RF bidding?
Just in terms of, it depends on your money source. Claire does have a little bit later in the slide referencing applicable federal and state laws. If it's your municipal funds, then you're following your municipal policies, any state regulations that apply to your municipality. If you're using federal or state funds, Claire can correct me, but there's an hierarchy of laws. You cannot say, I'm going to follow my local regulations if they're looser than the federal or state funds. Those are still federal and or state funds when you spend them, and you have to follow federal and state law and regulation.
Absolutely.
Regulation is another word for law.
Right.
If your local policies are tighter, that's fine. Continue to follow them. If they are looser, you don't have the option. You must follow the federal and or state regulations. They are more important in the legal hierarchy than the local ordinance.
Absolutely.
Important might not be the right word, but
it's so it's in the legal sphere, we call it authority. So the hierarchy of authority. But so if you look at a regulation as opposed to a statute, like a law, it's very similar to a policy and a procedure, right? So policy is the overarching intent and the overarching, this is what we're going to do, and this is how we're going to do it, and this is why we're doing it. The procedure is the actual, okay, this is what we're doing. The procedure is, here's actually how we do it. The statute tells you, for example, you have to pay taxes, right? That's what the Internal Revenue Code is. You have to pay taxes. Here's everybody who doesn't have to pay taxes. Here's different things that you can deduct from your taxes. Here's how you decide taxable income. But the procedures for paying taxes, right? And the procedures for getting your deduction are the regulations. So the purpose of regulations is to implement the statute. You can't have a regulation without a statute that authorizes the regulation. So it's very similar to your policy and procedures. For every policy, like Karen said, you should have a procedure, right? So that's the same idea. So if you know that there's a law that says you have to, the grant law says we're going to give you money, and this is how you're going to get this money. This is why we're giving you this money, and this is what we want this money to do. It's going to be those regulations that tell you specifically, okay, here's what you can use that money on. Here's how you have to report that money. Here's how you you have to, here's what you can't do with that money. And so that's another reason why it's very, very important. And the state has regulations too, for different things, just not as many as federal have. So that's, so RFP policies. We talked about credit card policies. Now, if you don't have a credit card, one option you can go is the purchase order route. So if you use purchase orders now for things like acquisitions for your library materials, and purchase orders was something that were very big, in the 90s and the 2000s and probably earlier, essentially made it possible for you to deal with a vendor, but not on a we buy, we pay, we buy, we pay kind of situation. It was more on, okay, we're going to submit documentation for you along. It's kind of like a contract to pay, and then you're going to send us a statement every so often, and we will pay on that statement. So a purchase order is more like a contract. It's like an agreement to pay for something that you want to get now. So in a way, it's a little bit like a credit card, but it's not, in the eyes of the law, what's called a secured transaction, which means, a credit card is, you're buying something based on, a calculation of your net worth, right? Or your library's net worth. So it's also a contract, but it's a little bit different. So things like, I know Amazon has a business accounts section where they do operate with some purchase orders for businesses. So that may be an option for you if you are not able to use credit cards. I went through it. It's not a perfect option at all, but it might be something that might work for your situation. My advice is that if you can't get a credit card and you're stuck, reach out to the vendor, because the vendors want to sell you stuff. And so a lot of them, particularly publishers and stuff, may be willing to work with you in that, especially considering the fact is the reason why you can't get a credit card is because under the law. So I would strongly encourage you to reach out for alternate solutions if you really are having an issue with that. Quote policies. If you're going to purchase things and you require quotes, not just as an RFP, but I'm talking like, oh, we're going to purchase, let's say we're going to have a makerspace and we're going to get a 3D printer. So it's not necessarily a high enough cost to do really an RFP, but it's a high enough cost that we want to see what our options are. So you go out and you ask a librarian, okay, we would like you to do some research and bring us back the 3 that are the best. What is your policy, or what is your procedure for getting quotes? Who can get quotes? Who can ask for quotes? Is it the directors, up to the director to get quotes? Can an individual board member just go off on their own and get quotes for things that they just think would be good to have? I would not recommend that. But, again, it's a policy or procedure that is up to the library. How are you going to deal with, that could be part of your purchasing policy. Again, when you're looking at purchase policies, like with any policy, you want to make sure you take a look at your applicable laws. As Karen mentioned, there are federal laws governing federal money. There's state laws governing state funds and corresponding grants, state or federal grants. Hopefully with grants, you should get information that will lead you to the appropriate laws. Under the state of Michigan, at least, there are constitutional requirements. As I mentioned, you have that public purpose doctrine to deal with, and you have things like conflict of interest laws and other laws that are a little bit more narrow. Then you may have some local restrictions, right? Individual municipalities can pass ordinances on all kinds of weird things. So, you may want to make sure that your local municipality, especially if you're purchasing something that is a little bit, I guess the main things I can think of would be things like broadband access or databases or basically technology, where, right now, because of a lot of problems going on with the way our culture is just kind of divided right now politically, with the book banning and discussions over certain parts of American history. I would not be surprised to see municipalities pass certain ordinances that might prevent purchases of certain types of things. So again, it might not be now, but it's something just, you want to always kind of in the back of your mind, keep an eye out on what's happening with your state and local laws regarding purchasing and stuff like that. Always read your grant requirements and your instructions. I know reading is not fun in this instance. We all love reading, but I know reading laws is not fun. Reading regulations is not fun. Reading particularly federal stuff can be very complicated and a pain in the butt and definitely not fun. But it's important. It's vitally important. And I know that library directors are not paid nearly what they're worth or nearly what the value of their job and effort requires. But the fact is, you're in an important authoritative position, and therefore you have a duty to make sure that you understand what the laws require, especially if you're not hiring an attorney, right? You have to have a good idea of, because telling a court that you just didn't know, they say ignorance is no excuse for violating the law. It's not. Saying you didn't know that something was wrong and you did it wrong may mitigate punishment a little bit, but it's not going to get you off the hook. And so again, very important to understand, what is wrong and what is not wrong. And there are people out there to help you. Donor or bequest conditions. So if you receive donations, whether it's from your friends group or whether it's from members of the community, read that bequest. Read it carefully. If there are conditions attached that say, okay, this money is only for this, or this money will only be given to you if the library does X, if the library names something, if the library buys something, if the library reorganizes something. Read that very carefully and weigh the impact of those instructions against the value of that donation, right? Just because someone gives you a donation doesn't mean you have to accept it. Every offer is negotiable. If someone wants to give you a donation and they're putting conditions on it that are just not tenable, the library can go back, either the director or a board member can go, or your attorney can go back and say, look, we really appreciate you thinking of us, but we just can't comply with this, and here's why. However, we would like to offer or suggest this, right? That I came across one library in Michigan where if the director is on the line, I'm not going to name the library, but you are a saint if this is on the line. They got a fairly large bequest for a small library, and part of the requirement was the library director has to tend the graves of the people that gave the money. And I'm sorry, that's way beyond anybody's job description. But if they accepted the bequest, and so now it is in the job description of the library director of that library. So, they have to make sure there's flowers on the grave and make sure that the urns are taken care of. And that's kind of crazy. So know that you have the ability to negotiate things, even including if it's a vendor contract, right? Nothing has to be written in stone. And as we talked before, make sure you understand local policies. So, if you're a municipality, if you're a city or a township library in your municipality, or county library, and your municipality has, financial requirements or financial policies, you might want to ask for a copy of them, and make sure that your policies are not terrifically deviating from, in a bad way, their policies. It may be that your policies are better. Okay, a note about friends groups, and Karen talked about this a little bit. Friends groups are separate nonprofit corporations in Michigan. So if you have a friend group that is able to take donations, they should be a nonprofit corporation, right, to legally take, donations. And they should be registered with the Attorney General's Charitable and Solicitation Division. Now, the Charitable and Solicitation Division, that law that put that in place, requires annual reporting. If you are a friends group that is makes gets less than 25K a year in donations and has a completely volunteer staff, then you're exempt from reporting. But you still have to register to let them know you're out there. You don't really have to do anything after that, but you have to register. So that means once they're a nonprofit corporation, that means that your friends group is a completely different company. Okay, just like any other nonprofit that is, near the library or works with the library. It is not a part of the library. It works closely with the library. It is not a part of the library. That means the library should not be managing the fund's finances. The library cannot dictate how the friends spend their money. There should be a memorandum of understanding between the friends and the library, and that will help avoid a lot of fights and consternation between the two entities, because an MOU will dictate this is what the library's expectations are to work with you, and this is what the friends' expectations are, because in any relationship there's a give and take. So if the friends are going to use library facilities and they're going to get certain advantages in the library building for purposes of fundraising, then the library also should get some concessions. So again, it's a negotiation, but the library cannot just assume because they have a friends group that that they get to dictate exactly what the fundraisers are and how that money gets used, and assume that of course they're going to get all of that money, because it is definitely a separate company, and nonprofit corporations have their own rules and their own law that dictates how their finances are supposed to be handled. And if they're a 501c3, now those regulations are even higher and even more complex as to what the friends group can and cannot do and what kind of reporting they have to have. So, that's something also that a library has to consider. A friends group is great, but you have to be careful and you have to make sure that you have policies and procedures for that relationship. And I think that we covered that. Do you want to add anything, Karen?
The only thing I would say is, friends groups are great for, for example, buying meals or sending something to a staff member for bereavement. But I would say kind of have, some policy around what you will ask them for, so that, if you need them to buy food, that's something they do regularly. I wouldn't use them for off the cuff. I can't legally buy this, so I'm going to turn around and ask them. I think that's problematic in your community, and it's problematic if there's an audit of that project when it's clear something was purchased and there's no documentation for how it was purchased, and you say, oh, our friends group bought it. I think there are probably some legal issues with essentially using your friends group to avoid laws and regulations.
Right. I agree. Okay, internal controls. So when we talk about policies, okay, so we went through purchasing policies. Internal controls is probably the next biggest, most important area of financial policies. So internal controls are specific policies and procedures that mitigate fraud and mismanagement of funds. The purpose of internal controls is to prevent mismanagement of funds and catch mismanagement of funds. So all of these policies are things like, how purchases are approved and how money is actually dispersed out, who signs checks, who approves electronic transfers. Do you need more than one board member when you go to the bank if they're going to move money around? Things like never sign a blank check. Things like the library director should not be able to reimburse themselves for things that they bought, even if it's the easiest thing. No, they should at least have to have a second signature. Policies on who can access valuable or vital assets, right? Who has the keys to the network? Who has the keys even to social media? Who has keys to the building? Who has the ability, everything from your bank account to your investments, who has the ability to move money in or out of investments? Who has access to security cam footage, to patron records? Who can change library cataloging records? Who has access to, say, mess with your 3D printer or other kinds of very expensive library of things, kinds of materials? Anything that is really valuable purchased with public money, or is part of the fundamental security and operation of the library, are things that should be carefully protected, right? So yeah, you're going to circulate all your books, but you have a way to do that, right? You check them out and people identify themselves and they have library cards. Well, does your staff or your board have the ability to take something without checking it out? And that's a small thing, but that's the kinds of things that maybe you want to make sure that there's some kind of understanding about, if not a written rule. The network thing is very important. So all of your library records, nowadays, everything, even your budget, everything could be digital. And who holds the keys to that cloud? Right? So is it one employee? Well, what if that employee is disgruntled, right? You want to make sure that you have safeguards in place to prevent one person from being able to cause serious damage. Or, maybe they have to sign the key out, or, something, so that you have the ability to see what is coming and going. Your credit card policy also falls under this. Who has the ability to use that credit card? What are they using it for, right? If they have a receipt that it doesn't say what they bought, sometimes when you buy things, you just get either more than one receipt, or you get a receipt that maybe just has like a SKU number on it, or isn't real specific as to what's bought, or doesn't have their name on it. Maybe you want to have a good policy for how do people get reimbursed? How do they prove to you what they bought was appropriate? A financial statement review. Make sure your board, someone other than the person who generates the statement, should be reviewing the statement to make sure that there's nothing that looks odd. There could just be a typo, right? It's not that maybe nobody's trying to do anything bad, but people do transpose numbers. People do make mistakes. So it's important that there's a second set of eyes on your financial statements. Your board should always have copies of financial reports. Probably every board meeting, they should have, like, once a month, they should have access to, here is the status of the library, accounts. And then of course you have audits, right? The law mandates that public libraries have audits during certain periods. Sometimes it's every 2 years. Make sure that your board gets a report on that audit. Sometimes if your municipality handles your audit, the municipality will get a presentation, but not the library board. I would ensure that your library board gets a presentation from the auditor about the audit, and not just the municipality. Ensure that your board, or the director, if the board wants, is involved in that audit. How that audit is done, who does it, they supply numbers, that's important, right? It shouldn't just be blindly, I'm just going to give these numbers and I don't care what happens to them. Part of internal controls, because internal controls can be comprised of multiple kinds of policies. Fraud management is one of those policies. So fraud management is a general policy that just basically lays the groundwork for how an institution is going to deal with these kinds of matters. So what their ethics are, what the responsibilities are of staff and management with regards to different types of financial aspects. A lot of times it will list common areas of fraud, and we'll talk about things like protection of personal information, which there is a separate law that requires that entities take care with personal information, so people's names and addresses, and if you keep like social security numbers, all that kind of thing. I know there are lots of libraries that take driver's license numbers for things. That counts as personal information and has to be treated very carefully. Conflict of interest, so that your board members all understand what that means. Everything from, again, they can't have the library buy something that they're going to directly benefit from. If the library finds that's the best deal, then the board member has to recuse themselves from any, voting or discussion on it. To things like the Incompatible Offices Act, which says that, one government employee cannot hold more than one government job if one of the jobs is either subservient to or supervisory over the other position. So for example, a board member cannot be the library director. The library director cannot be on the board, right? That's a direct violation of that. You will see that, township employees should not be on the library board. So there's a lot of attorney general opinions on this. So that's considered conflict of interest. If the library has a close relationship with the municipal treasurer, and the municipal treasurer deals a lot with library funds, they should not be on the library board. There is a big loophole to that, though, which is there's another law that says municipalities can lend employees to other municipal entities to help. So some municipal entities use that as a workaround to permit employees to sit on boards of public libraries. So unfortunately, that is a thing. The fraud management will also clarify actions the library will take to deter fraud and address fraudulent actions. So what is the policing mechanism? What kinds of punishment or what kinds of retribution could there be? And what, for each of these kinds of things, what is the library going to put in place to prevent it? What is the procedure or policy? A lot of times they provide for routine reporting, and they also address financial reporting records and records retention. There is, I know it looks like we're running short on time, there is a really good explanation of fraud management and a sample policy in the library, the public library financial management guide. So I would strongly recommend that everybody take a look at that. There's also a really good overview of fiscal, it's called Fiscally Ready Communities, and that it's from the Department of Treasury and MSU. It's kind of a joint thing they worked on. And that has a really good description of financial management for government entities. And that is linked at the end of our slides. Karen, is there anything else that you would like to mention?
There are some questions in the chat, and I think with
Okay.
our time, perhaps Claire and I can just send an email out to everyone that attended.
Yep.
With answers. That way we can all go on for lunch. The financial management guide, I'm going to post the link in chat right now. It needs some updating of links because the state is moving to a new content management system, and Treasury's links are all changing. As soon as Treasury is done changing their links, we will be updating the guide. So if you get a bad link when you're looking at that, please be patient. We're working on it. And finally, we do have a financial management cohort. The first cohort is wrapping up. Their graduation is next month. We're going to do a second round of this. This is a certification program with the University of Georgia School of Government. And the trainer involved is a former public library financial person. She's very knowledgeable. What we do, we take about 30 people, and it is 6 classes with the University of Georgia on various financial topics, and you get a certificate when you're done. Participating in the cohort means we pay the tuition for that, and you have regular interactions with the trainer outside of the classes. So when you see that go out on Miss Libel this summer, if you're interested, please sign up. It will take a good amount of your time over the year, but we've gotten really good responses from everybody that participated in the last year.
I would strongly recommend that you do that if you know you would like some more background on the financial aspects. It's a really good. I would like to take it.
I hear government accounting was hard and the rest was easy.
Okay. Well, there's some more information on the slides that y'all will get. If you have any questions about that, don't hesitate to reach out to myself or Karen, and we'd be happy to go over it with you. And I think now that I'm thinking about it, maybe that next time we do this, we'll do it in a two-parter, and that way we'll be able to take care of more information. Thank you all for coming. I hope y'all have a great weekend and a great rest of your day. And Karen and I will work through these questions. Thank you to Becky, as always, for being there for us. And I wish y'all a great rest of your day. Thanks a lot.